The idea that in social media, you could have every post be a coin, right? I do think this is a bit where we're headed.
Welcome back to the Crypto Playbook. This is episode 5, the next era of crypto. I'm Jeff John Roberts.
And I'm Leo Schwartz.
And on this episode, we have a real crypto OG, Olaf Carlson-Wee, the first employee of Coinbase and also one of the first to launch a venture capital fund, Polychain Capital. Olaf has been around forever and has seen each era. And today we're going to discuss with him on what's going to come next. I guess, Leo, what do you think is going to come next? Crypto is now almost 15 years old. What do you see the current trends to be and where's it all going?
So we're in this very weird era of crypto where since Bitcoin started and since you've been covering crypto, it's really been a promise to change every single industry out there, from art with NFTs to gaming. I don't think we've seen much of that really come to pass in a mainstream way. Right now, what would define this era, I would say, is the financialization of crypto, where the biggest use case right now is stablecoins, which is basically dollars on a blockchain, which is pretty far from this sexy idea of what crypto can do and what it can really disrupt. Instead, you sort of have Wall Street taking over. But what I think makes Olaf interesting is, rather than being one of these investors who comes in more from the Wall Street side, he's always really been on this forefront of the avant-garde of what crypto can be, sort of the mesh of both culture and also cutting edge technology like AI, and seeing where that intersects with crypto. Polychain has been immensely successful in terms of being able to make money and return funds to its investors. At the same time, I think it'd be hard to say that any of the more cutting edge projects it's backed have really had a sort of mainstream breakthrough. Jeff, I know that you've obviously known Olaf for a very long time. You wrote the book on Coinbase. What's been your impression of his work?
He is very dedicated to the cutting edge, and he's deep in the crypto communities. And yeah, I think a lot of these things, it's true, haven't panned out, but I don't necessarily knock him or crypto for that. Yeah, the narrative shifts. Not all the projects work out, but I mean, that's the nature of technology. That was the nature of the internet. I think some of the things have been kind of silly in retrospect. I mean, at some point, crypto is going to take over all of land registries and copyright, art market, and this and that. And I mean, for whatever reason, crypto is prone to these, big kind of grandiose plans. And you're right, the current thing that's actually has worked out is definitely a lot less sort of exciting or interesting. I mean, the financialization of, crypto and stable coins is the big story right now. But at the same time, I want to probe the more interesting things, what's the dream of Web3 and using, blockchain for, new communities and self-sovereignty and all that. And I think that's very much thriving. And I'm curious what Olaf is going to say about that, about meme coins, about AI, and where it's all going next. Because yes, a lot of projects have been a flop, but each time the technology gets a little bit better and there's kind of a platform to do something with it. Or what do you think, Leo? Is that too optimistic?
I mean, we've talked about this in the past, where I do think crypto often tries to wedge itself into other industries and other conversations. AI is a great example of this, where now this is probably the biggest segment of American GDP growth. And crypto, of course, says we want a cut of the pie. We think that, you can have autonomous agents going out and making payments, or we can decentralize the way that training works. And I think all of these massive AI companies like OpenAI and Anthropic are like, we don't even think about you. But of course, the idea of the technology of what crypto could do and how it can improve anything from AI to even land registration is there. As you said, I think the technology has to often catch up. And another issue is that smart people come into the field, but they often make a huge amount of money very quickly and leave. They lose their motivation to stay in there. But you have seen with some technologies like stablecoins, which I started covering over 5 years ago. And at that point, the technology wasn't quite there, the liquidity wasn't there, the partners weren't there. And you really have seen a development happen over the past few years. So I think there is a clear case to say it can happen. It takes time. And what the visionaries are saying right now might not come to pass for a while. So it will be interesting to see what happens. But of course, a VC like Olaf is going to pitch his book and say, these are the things that I think are going to change the world tomorrow. And I hope you also ask Olaf about how he might be the only lumberjack turned crypto investor out there.
Definitely, and probably the crypto person with the best hair of all time. So we'll be sure to get deep on those things too.
Yeah, well, looking forward to the conversation.
Olaf Carlson-Wee, I'm thrilled to have you. for our guests. Olaf is one of the OGs of crypto. He's been there since the very beginning. He's going to talk to us about where it's all going. But first, Olaf, can you please just tell the story? Some people know it, some people don't, of how you first came to crypto.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. So I got into Bitcoin in 2011. I read about it online and was going into my undergraduate studies senior year and decided to write my thesis on Bitcoin. So at the time, Bitcoin was very much more an open source software project than a sort of industry the way we think about it today. I was working as a lumberjack for a stint there. And wanted to get into the sort of crypto space, but the crypto space didn't really exist. I was the 30th user of Coinbase, like the 30th user of the website, and cold emailed Coinbase with my kind of undergraduate thesis attached, and basically said I'll work any job. So I started there as customer support and the first employee. Worked there for 3 years and then left to start one of the first sort of cryptocurrency investment funds, Polychain.
Yeah, I love that story too. And I remember you telling me at some point, it's just good advice for startups: hire your own customers because they know you and they're passionate about it. And I think that's just such a cool story. But let's kind of fast forward into the future a little bit, because you've kind of seen it all. You came in the early Bitcoin days, early Coinbase days, and you had one of the very first crypto VC funds. So looking back, what are the biggest sort of successes and failures do you think of crypto so far?
So I think what's very interesting is crypto, like other sort of tech cycles in a sense, it first is used to enable stuff that simply was not possible before. This is everything that is sort of natively enabled with cryptocurrency, and then sort of trickles down to add efficiencies to things that already exist. So, for example, with Bitcoin, we have sort of electronic gold. That's this sort of network run asset, and this sort of sovereign to the internet asset, not controlled by any central party. You really couldn't build that without this technology. Then with the advent of Ethereum, we have things like smart contracts that allow for peer-to-peer trading, peer-to-peer lending, peer-to-peer, really any sort of financial contract you can imagine, sort of online internet native corporations, not really based in any sort of jurisdiction or geography. But then over time, what we've seen is, as those things were created, which were like these inventions, natively made possible with blockchains, we now are seeing just efficiencies added to things that already existed. So for example, right now, one of the very big highest growth categories is pretty much stable coins, which are effectively just dollars on a blockchain. And it's interesting because for years, many companies worked on Bitcoin payments, thinking that they would add efficiencies to e-commerce or cross-border payments or remittances and things like that. And it turns out that it took a while for people to realize really the demand there was just for dollars on the blockchain. Now we're moving towards a world where I think over the long term, every single asset across every single asset class is embedded onto blockchains. And it sort of is the substrate that runs the entire global economy. So every contract between every person, every trade, every asset issuance, everything will all sort of be run on this unified blockchain substrate. But to get there, we sort of needed to enable this stuff that was like uniquely possible with blockchains. And then over time, we could move towards these things where there were just added efficiencies with blockchains. But I really do think, like, one of the things you see today is that stablecoin trade volume, for example, is over 10% of the trade volume of like the US bond market. So, we're really approaching levels where the trade volume of dollars on the blockchain are getting close to like the market that prices the dollar off the blockchain, so to speak. And so then at some point, these blockchain-based markets move from being these sort of second-class, obscure markets to actually the primary marketplace where things are being priced, including like the dollar.
Yeah, no, I think it's now that we're seeing it materialize, it all seems obvious. And I think a lot of technologies are that way, and early technologies too. It takes a few iterations, and sometimes the killer app isn't what you think it is, and it's taken longer than we thought. But I do want to get into the next phase of crypto. But quickly looking back, is there anything kind of you think, if you could do it over again, or if you could whisper in everyone's ear, what sort of, would have made it go faster? Why did it take so long, and what were the biggest mistakes or obstacles in hindsight?
Oh man, that's tricky. I think that in a way, like some of the most obvious concepts were perhaps the least exotic, like for example, dollars on the blockchain. So we have a lot of folks doing hardcore research on using zero knowledge cryptography, on consensus protocols, on even quantum resistant cryptography, on novel financial mechanisms to incentivize certain types of behavior, etc., like novel trading contracts, financial contracts. And so a lot of very smart people working on these kind of cutting edge stuff. And I think that some of the most obvious or simple ideas that are maybe a little bit less sexy turn out to be the really, successful ones. So like dollars on the blockchain. This is a very old idea. It's not very complex. From a theoretical perspective, it's just sort of put dollars in a bank account, and for everyone that's in the bank account, issue one on the blockchain. And that's it. It's not like this. It's not even per se a new tech concept, really. It's just sort of like a different way of using the system. I also think, though, that having these kind of meme markets emerge, I think it took a while for people to wrap their heads around the idea that you could have multiple assets that have value. So hence the name of my firm, Polychain. When I started Polychain, which was in 2016, one of the reasons I called it Polychain is that was a very heretical concept, that there could be more than one asset with value here. At the time, it was just Bitcoin. And so that was like 7 years into the cryptocurrency space. And the very strong consensus view was that Bitcoin was the only thing that had value or ever would have value. If we could have sort of made everyone realize that this was more sprawling and complex than that earlier, I think that would have been good. Because nowadays you see like a very fascinating behavior where every time a new news event or meme gets created, just anything that's like viral on social media or on the internet, you immediately see a coin sort of launched and attached to it, right? And so those sort of meme coin markets, in a way, they almost look like information markets, where price discovery in these meme coins is sort of downstream, but in some way predictive of the relevancy of the cutting edge of information being released on the internet. So this is like beyond just Polychain. It's almost like there will be a coin for every post, right? It's taking that even one step further than even say I would have thought of when I launched Polychain. And so I think getting people to one, accept more radical ideas of what this was, and then two, accept very simple, obvious, right in front of us ideas. So if that makes sense, I think we got always a little captured by one step ahead versus just what was right in front of us and what was very far distance away.
Yeah, I think you're onto something because remember, like in DeFi summer, there's ever more exotic, elaborate ways to kind of do DeFi operations. And for normies, heck, even for me, I was like, this is starting to go over my head. And the UX, it's just like simplify it, explain it in a way I can use it. And the other point you made too, in terms of, I think for the longest time, there's kind of a civil war of like the Bitcoiners versus everything else, which I understand the position. You don't want to, compromise Bitcoin, but I do think there's room for a plurality of chains and uses. And also, I think the crypto culture, I think people sometimes don't realize how rich crypto culture is. And meme culture is an expression of that too. I was heard from someone who said they found out the Pope died by watching like meme coins emerge on it, and I think being able to radically spin up a community in short order, you can really do a lot with that. You've got passion, financial incentives, and technology. So I think that sort of is some promise. Quickly, what about the UX though? I mean, something that's I've watched and I've often wondered. I remember this at Vermont like 9 years ago wanted to put its land registry on the blockchain. It seemed to make perfect sense, and yet it didn't happen. DMVs, stuff like that. Blockchain seemed to have such a perfect use for it, but it never came to be. And I think a lot of it was because of the UX. Do you think that's fair? And do you think that's now changing now that it is becoming more commonplace?
Yeah, so I think there's two things. So one is that things like a land registry or title insurance on a blockchain, and really a lot of what you might call this RWA or real world assets being embedded on the blockchain, it makes perfect sense, right? Because we have this series of heterogeneous databases all around the world, all like registering who owns what across every different geography, and it's absolutely not one unified system. So the idea that we could have one unified system, not just for land and property, but also for equities and stock, and also for debt, and it's obviously quite elegant. I actually think the problem is less UX per se than just regulatory changes. Um, to get, as you said, the DMV using the blockchain, I think is less of a UX problem and more of a, it's not so much a tech barrier. It's more of a, how can we really just get to these legacy institutions to move to a new system when they have little incentive to, or in some cases, like a reverse incentive, like they actually might fear the new system or being made obsolete because the new system is more efficient. You also mentioned something that I think is really interesting and notable, though, about UX, which is, you mentioned someone found out the Pope died because they were looking at like crypto coins. So I mentioned earlier about how these new like meme coins sort of act as the information discovery system for like the cutting edge of information markets. And the idea that in social media, you could have every post be a coin, right? I do think this is a bit where we're headed. And so from a UX perspective, it's like, instead of a For You page on, say, Twitter or Instagram, where an algorithm determines what you see, I really could see a future where there are underneath that market mechanisms where traders betting on what content will become popular actually organizes the information on the internet for you. So rather than sort of a centralized algorithm controlled by one of these big companies determining what you see, you're almost looking at a like trending assets page, um, or top movers today, and it could be sort of an equivalent of relevant information for you today, right? Where instead of having central algorithms sort of determine what everyone sees, you have market makers and traders and speculators in the background actually organizing the world's information. So in that case, the UX for the end user could maybe just be like a newsreel or like a For You reel. But they don't necessarily realize that in the background, there's probably a bunch of pretty complex UX and financial engineering and trading firms, et cetera, determining what shows up there. So it kind of, it cuts both ways, where there's a regulatory factor, and then there's also these areas where there's sort of the complex, underside, and then the easy to use outcome of that complex, trading and financial engineering.
Yeah, I think you're on to something, including with the regulatory thing too, because I've worked in government. Government is very good at record keeping. They have the records. Government is horrible about technology, both as for people who go there and the incentives once you're there too. It's just you're sort of stuck with that. But eventually they get there, and it will be interesting in the next iteration to get there. And also what you're saying too is sort of like information markets. And if you could sort of apply that to culture and have it bubble up and decentralized, of my interests that are built around meme coins or something like that. I'm trying to get my head around that, and I see where you're going. I guess one challenge I think I have with it too is the sort of people who are market makers and deep in technology are not reflective of society at large. It's going to be very heavy on 20 to 40 something guys who are very proficient at technology. And they actually, who's usually at the avant-garde of culture is teen girls and young women. And I'm kind of wondering, can you see a world where meme coins kind of are also exported to these other sort of segments of the population? I mean, of course there's overlap, and of course there's teen girls who are into crypto, but I think you know what I'm saying. I think you would want a common UX so that everyone can participate and you can draw from culture at large, not the somewhat selective culture of the crypto world.
Yep, and this is the beauty of it being, I guess, an open competitive market, is if the content for a certain demographic is underrepresented, maybe that's your trading strategy, and you have an edge in the market. So, in theory, markets should pretty rapidly correct those inefficiencies, because effectively there's profit to be made if you can more accurately, bet what will be the relevant information than somebody else. So I do think I have a faith that as long as there's enough liquidity and volume, that these trading firms, no matter who they're run by, will eventually either lose to folks who are more accurately representing the interests of, the sort of information markets, or they will actually discover, the right sort of information and bet on it correctly. So you bring up a second point, though, that I think is interesting, which is that it's not just crypto being a reflection of this sort of, meme culture or cutting edge of information being released on the internet. In fact, crypto has become a pretty big part of this sort of meme culture and release of information on the internet, because of this dynamic I mentioned of, like, meme coins, or being sort of information markets, and in certain cases it being actually the fastest way that information is being disseminated and organized on the internet. It means that crypto is often like the primary, like, tip of the spear where new trends are showing up. So there's a dual thing, a dual effect here. One is culture sort of being reflected in crypto, and the other is sort of crypto trends being reflected in mainstream culture.
Let's go specifics for a sec, though, too. I do think the other thing that makes it challenging is the wallet, which is kind of a misnomer. Somehow that's what they became called. But wallets, it's not really, the metaphor doesn't really work. Wallets is something you store and hold something, but what you're discussing is something a lot more dynamic. So going forward, I don't know, if you, for some reason, could control the pedagogy of every high school and college, what would you give every high school senior and college freshman? Would you give them a wallet, or where would be the big pool of people who aren't deep in this? How do you get them into it? What is the kind of application for them to discover and participate?
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit like financial services. What gets people into Robinhood, trading equities, what gets people sending money cross border, what gets people taking out a mortgage, right? It's effectively finance, right? And so the more people get interested in finance, the more that this is going to be relevant for them. I do think that the word wallet is, from, the Bitcoin era, so to speak, of a long time ago. And the complex thing is nowadays it almost can look and feel more like a browser, where, there's rich or complex application interfaces that people use through that sort of wallet, so to speak. on the other hand, though, it is generally finance in one way or another. So it sort of looks and feels like um, a more immersive financial account, that, it is grounded in finance, but definitely not static the way a bank account might be.
Right. Or maybe we can look for inspiration. You're a well-traveled guy to Asia where, you've got your sort of the wallets there are not, you don't have one thing to do your social media, and you don't have one to do your payments. You don't have one to do this and that, where it's bundled into one. I wonder if that sort of will be kind of like, it'll be within that world where, you've got a sort of an everything app that includes crypto and meme coins and everything. Is that possible, do you think?
Yeah, I do think that's possible. Because I know it sounds exotic now, but I do think that um like information markets based on, a crypto substrate will actually determine a lot of the organization of the information you see. And then pretty much any sort of financial service you use, whether that's a Venmo like system of paying a friend, a mortgage like system, that's like a very large and often most important financial transaction people do in their life, um, or like, any sort of trading or, more traditional finance use. So let's say you want to raise capital for a company you're starting, or let's say you want to create and issue an asset, whether that's an airline mile or, a new company, or it's a collectible card or a video game item, right? I do think eventually all of these things will be unified into a singular, like, interoperable substrate, um, that also is global and not controlled by any sort of specific geography or set of financial institutions. So I think that that is where we're headed. And in the end, the successful UX, I think, abstracts away the way the sort of car engine works the most. I might argue that today people probably understand less about the way computers work than users, of computers in the 90s. Like it exposed more of the back end to you. And nowadays everything is quite abstracted away from, like the way the hardware works and the way the low level software interacts with the hardware. I think we're moving that same direction with crypto, where the sort of low level engineering will be abstracted away.
My final question, Olaf, is I was able to speak to your friend and your old boss, Brian Armstrong, founder of Coinbase, a little while ago. And just as an aside, was asking him about AI and crypto. We were talking about something else, but he floated the notion of everyone having a crypto agent with a little crypto purse going around so it can transact on your behalf. And I found that also a very intriguing idea. So what do you think about that and AI and crypto more broadly?
So, one interesting thing is that since the creation and development of so much of this crypto tech, a sort of new, you might almost call it customer, has been created, which is this idea of an agent or an AI, an AI agent that's acting on someone's behalf. So, there's a bunch of interesting things about these agents. One is, they can't like sign pen and paper contracts. They can't open bank accounts. They can't, own things in a bank account or a custodial account like that. All of these different actions are uniquely made possible for agents through blockchains. So they can enter into contracts using software or math like smart contracts on blockchains. They can own assets in crypto wallets, and they can transact with real people or other agents using crypto wallets. So effectively, I think unknowingly, we built the perfect substrate for these AI agents before the AI agents ever existed. So I think it's quite likely that this will be the sort of substrate or sort of backbone of choice for AI agents that are operating in the wild, is basically crypto systems. And you really might have an agent who works for you that's trained on your preferences or things like that, finding information to show you that is relevant. It may find investments for you. It may be trading on your behalf. It's really quite hard to predict, especially because these agents are getting smarter and smarter every day. And eventually, when we have agents capable of making even smarter agents, it's sort of impossible for anyone to predict where that will end. But I do think that the chosen logical substrate for these AI agents is basically blockchains.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I love this conversation about the future because people are often alarmed about the future, but a lot of the stuff just sounds so full of creativity and potential. It's really exciting. Okay, on that note, Olaf, I want to thank you for joining us. And there we have it, Olaf Carlson-Wee, former lumberjack and founder and CEO of Polychain Capital. Thank you.
Yep, thanks for having me.
So Jeff, I'm glad that we got the down low on Olaf's lumberjack journey, but I'm curious when we're going to have the first tokenized lumber product in the crypto world.
Oh, I'm sure someone's out there selling it already. But yeah, no, it is fun hearing. He's got one of the best origin stories of crypto. He's such a character and he tells the story really well. But in terms of what he said, what do you think? I think the thing that grabbed me the most was this notion of meme coins of culture as culture. And every time something comes up, there'll be a meme coin helping to identify and set the trend. What do you think?
It is a divide that I think is really fascinating in crypto. And you hear, especially among the venture class, which is those who say meme coins are basically all speculation and distraction. I'm going to stay away from them. And then the ones who say meme coins are actually sort of at the cutting edge of what the financial system means. And it's really a way for people to articulate culture in a completely different way that has monetary value attached to it. And again, is that just talking their book, or is it actually looking at where a new segment of finance and culture is going to converge and emerge? You have this with prediction markets and sports betting. So why not be able to have someone launching some new art project be able to also tie a token to themselves? I don't know. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it might just be window dressing for pure degenerate gambling, but it is an interesting idea.
Yeah, fair. It's the tail wagging the dog. But I don't know. I wouldn't underestimate culture. Like people used to ridicule like fanfic and discussion boards on the internet, but they've turned into some of the most, powerful cultural forces that are out there. And, I think with, meme coins, yeah, it does seem sort of silly at first, but I think there is something there, that we're going to have these. But then again, the flip side is how many people want to integrate, sort of degen gambling into their day-to-day fandom and cultural activities. I guess we'll find out. In any case, we're out of time, and just like to thank everyone for listening again, and thank our guest Olaf Carlson-Wee. And that's a wrap. I'm Jeff John Roberts.
And I'm Leo Schwartz. See you next time.
This was the Crypto Playbook, a podcast by Fortune Magazine.
This episode was produced by Jalon Ursoy and edited by Ellen Estev. Art direction by Ariel Ray. Fortune's executive producer is Lydia Randall. Head of video is Adam Bannicky.
Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.